All right, so we talked last class about social Darwinism and this idea that you could actually apply Darwin's principles to different races of human beings. And in this way, you could justify a lot of things that had already been going on, like colonialism, but you could furthermore justify almost any extent of cruelty on the basis of this principle that you were going to be submitting your group, or at least a group, maybe the other group, to the kind of hardship through which improvement by this process of evolution happens. But it's also true that racism was there before social Darwinism. And so one of the things that we have to consider is the extent to which the two things are related. Clearly they're related. Once you apply social Darwinism to groups on the basis of race, which again is more of a social construction, but which correlates fairly well to the continent of one's ancestors' origin, once you do that, then clearly you're into the territory of racism. Clearly, once you are enslaving people on the basis of where they come from geographically, when in particular that they are physically distinct from you on that basis, you're dealing with something that is racism. It doesn't mean that there were not economic pressures that came to bear on colonialists by which they wanted to impress labor for free, because obviously that was the cheapest way of doing it. But there just was not this sort of like very well developed and concretized kind of racism before then. But there was racism, clearly. Of that much we can be certain. So one of the questions to ask ourselves is why there's racism at all. Why is it that we as human, and it's not as if we can sort of we can identify racism as a phenomenon emerging around the time that colonialism really takes off, because that's the first significant interaction that we have of people of different races interacting to any significant extent. There might have been small communities of ethnic groups that were minorities among majority ethnic groups in different places. But by and large, this distinction of race doesn't become something that's constant and ongoing until colonialism begins. Now, it's possible, certainly, that there is just the matter of a less well-defined social Darwinism being applied by us the minute that us here being Europeans, my apologies to those of you that are not of European ancestry, in interacting with people from the Americas, and then 100 years later interacting with people from Africa, that there's the assumption of your supremacy as a European, and therefore you subject these people, and you're able to do that because you're more technologically advanced. It doesn't have the veneer of Darwin's specific terminology, poorly applied as it might be. And I want to be clear on this point. I mean, Darwin himself was not a proponent of social Darwinism. He was quite clear on the point that although he was a white supremacist in the way that all Europeans were white supremacists in the 19th century, which is to say that there was probably no particular kind of personal hatred that he felt. He just assumed, on the basis of all of the available evidence that he had to him, that Europeans were just better than other people. He nevertheless acknowledged, because he traveled worldwide, he acknowledged that that all of the groups of human beings that he encountered in different places were as human as he was. And this was on the basis of the fact that there could be fertile offspring, and so what he was not about to do was suspend the universality of his principles just to continue a racist belief that couldn't be borne out by evidence. And he also acknowledged that these cultures that he found, for instance, he had gone to Australia, so he had seen the Australian Aborigines, that they were significantly less technologically advanced. But he also didn't deny that that any group of human beings had the innate ability to learn whatever it was that Europeans themselves had learned. So Darwin rejected social Darwinism. With colonialism and the way that we apply these principles of superiority and this equivalence between technological advancement and innate worth as human beings, we do that before social Darwinism comes on the scene. But at the same time, we don't have the sophisticated terminology to apply to it, and the sophisticated ideas that Darwin gives us. So we're sort of tempted to call it racism rather than social Darwinism. But it nevertheless does raise this question of why we make these assumptions. Because it's one thing to chalk it all up to the simple matter of technological advancement. But you still find animosity between East Asians and Europeans when the difference in technological advancement is minimal, and when, in fact, there are areas of East Asia that are significantly more advanced than areas of Eastern Europe. There is nevertheless an animosity that is felt between East Asians on one hand and Europeans on the other. They're willing to trade with each other because economically that benefits them both. They don't have any concrete interactions with one another because Europeans don't occupy any of the territories in which East Asians live until the 19th century. And even then, it's just ports in China. So the question then is, well, why this animosity? Why is there dislike of people outside one's own group? Is it just a matter of competition, or whether economic or, well, principally economic, I guess? Or is there something deeper lying there? That's a question that I think is an important one to consider, because if we look at it from the standpoint that social Darwinism would ask us to, but not suspend the principles of evolution just to sort of excuse racist overtones, then we have to ask ourselves questions like, well, why are people in general hostile to groups of people that don't look like them? And to answer the question requires us to consider, again, some stuff that we considered at the beginning of the class, like the fact that for 95% of our history as a species, we didn't live in cities. We didn't live in permanent settlements. We lived in bands of people of about 25 in number, all of whom we were related to probably no more distantly than, third or fourth cousins. So anybody remember, like, the basic principle of power within hunter-gatherer bands, the way that they operate in terms of their power distribution? Yeah.
Stronger people have more power.
Sort of. So there's a general kind of division of power between men and women because, generally speaking, men are physically stronger than women, and so men can physically dominate women. But in general, across a hunter-gatherer band, there's sort of a broadly distributed equality, because the group recognizes that everybody within the band is necessary to the band's survival. Now, we know that a band like that is going to work much better if the people are related to each other, because of something that's called a selfish gene. Basically, the idea that for people that are related to you, you are willing to be more altruistic than for people that are not related to you. And moreover, that not only is it true that you're more likely to be altruistic to people that are related to you, but the extent to which you are going to not be altruistic to people unrelated to you is going to be directly proportional to how distant they are from you in terms of their relationship. So one of the things that you are probably aware of is that people that are related to each other resemble each other. Yes? Nod. So when one group of hunter-gatherers now comes into conflict with another group of hunter-gatherers, part of their way of knowing that they're among strangers is a lack of recognition. First of all, there's just the ability of people, generally speaking, to keep about 100 people that they know in their head at any basic point in time at different layers of memory, right? So now you come into contact with people that your brain doesn't call up as recognizing, and that's going to throw you for a loop. But, you know, maybe they'll speak the same language, and so some deal could be struck. Or maybe they'll look like you close enough, and some deal will be struck. But if they don't speak your language, if they look very different from you, then your suspicion is going to be significantly greater of them, biologically speaking. Why? Because for 95% of our existence, being deeply, deeply suspicious of people not related to you was a really, really good survival strategy. It meant you were going to live. And the extent to which you could be on your guard and be ready to exercise aggression against people that didn't look like you, that was going to help you too. So, from the standpoint of evolution, 3,000 years is not a long time. And now, all of a sudden, we're living in cities where people are not closely related to each other. They may still be all of the same ethnic group, but they don't have the familial relation that would lend itself to altruism. You have class division that arises with the emergence of cities. You have crowding, which is something that also contributes to aggression. And so you get aggression between people within the same group. When you then add to an inherent aggression that comes along with living within an urbanized environment, you throw in now groups of people who are physically differently looking. It's not as if we got rid of those genes. They're still there, and they still kick in. So, and that's not to say that those genes make people racist, by the way. What those genes do is make people suspicious and fearful and on their guard. That doesn't mean they can't be overridden. They can be. And clearly, in a globalized society, where, and in a country like ours, where there are people of multiple ethnic, racial, religious backgrounds, it's beneficial to us to override it. But it has to be taught to be overridden. By the same token, if you nurture the suspicion, then you can take what is merely a suspicion and you can turn it into something that is much more insidious, which is racism. And when racism emerges in this way, it has sort of loaded within it a specific kind of power connotation underlying it, which is to say that it goes more than just suspicion becoming prejudiced. I don't want to live next door to those people, or I don't want to do business with those people, or I don't want my children marrying those people. But it becomes, I'm going to pressure my politicians to be sure that the possibility of me living next door to those people never even emerges in the first place. I'm going to make sure that my schools are different from their schools so that the possibility of them marrying my children never even emerges. When you take prejudice and you put the ability to use power, particularly government power, behind it, then it becomes a particularly insidious kind of force. It's one thing that we live in outside of large cities, and even to a certain extent within large cities, we live in a pretty racially segregated society. You wouldn't think of it in looking at this room, but we do. The vast majority of the country, particularly in the rural areas of the country, with the exception of parts of the Deep South, are white. In the cities in the Northeast, in particular, there are large African American and Asian and Latino populations, but they tend to live in their own areas. That's not done by law. It's done by and large by choice and by some economic pressures. I mention this because it is sometimes tempting to point to that reality that we, by and large, still live in segregated society in the Northeast, in parts of the Midwest. That we live in that kind of segregation is nevertheless fundamentally different from the kind of segregation that existed in the Deep South until the 1960s, because that segregation had the full power of law behind it, with everything that goes along with that, which is to say that not just the exercise of political power in terms of the ability to pass laws to assure that segregation remained the standard for that society, but economic power in terms of assuring that certain jobs would only ever go to people of one race. Ideological power in terms of making sure that people understood that white supremacy was not just something that you might personally feel, but was a pervasive state-wide ideology of the governors that were in power at that time. And then finally, military power, that when people crossed the line, they would be punished with violence. Those things are what makes racism on the level that existed in the Deep South when it was part of a state system, sort of a level even higher than the kind of racism that still exists, you know, in the United States today. Because I don't think that any of us are particularly naive on the point that that racism, you know, is gone. So. That is sort of a broad overture on the topic of racism, right? It is the result of consciously or subconsciously nurturing what at one point was probably a useful, well, was very much so a useful evolutionary advantage that we had, but that now doesn't really do us much good. And it doesn't, by the way, if we add things like economic pressure, it becomes even more easy to nurture that negative instinct, which is to say that it's one thing to look at the history of the southern United States, see the institution of chattel slavery, which was applied only to African Americans and therefore was racially stratified in its very foundations, and understand that despite emancipation, that was going to introduce its own inherent problems with regard to racism. But it's another to then see things like the automatic addition to the labor pool after emancipation of now all able-bodied African-American men, and the pressure that that exerts on working-class white people in the South to say, well, now with the larger labor pool, my ability to get a particular wage is going to be more difficult because the supply now of laborers is much larger. How do you apply economic principles? If you are a laborer, your ability to get the wage that you're looking for is going to be dependent to some extent on the demand for your labor, whether there are jobs, and the number of workers that are out there. So now, overnight, the number of available laborers increases by 1/3, which is what happens when there's emancipation. Your wages go down. How do you combat that? How do you combat that in particular when you don't have the economic wherewithal to have government solve the problem? Because what government does not do at the end of the Civil War is step in and say, okay, well, we're going to freeze wages. And whatever the employers can't cover, we're going to cover by a government bailout. It was the end of the Civil War, and the government was bankrupt. So government couldn't have done that even if it wanted to. So how are you going to make sure that your wages remain high when you have added 1/3 more laborers to the labor pool? You got to attack it either from supply or demand. If you can't attack it by supply, because what are you going to do? You can't reinstitute slavery. Then you attack it from demand. You're going to make it clear that that employers won't hire black people, and that way you'll be able to artificially keep the wage higher than it would be if everybody were given an opportunity to compete for a job equally. So there is a body of thinking about class division or racial division in this country that seeks to understand it mainly through class division, which is to say, in particular, with regard to the working class of both white and black people, and now Latino people as well, that it is a deliberate ploy on the part of the bourgeoisie to sow racial discord among working class people so that they will not unite in their struggle against management, and instead will remain a fractionated body of workers who are not united. Now, I'm not saying that that is true. What I'm saying is that that's one way of looking at the problem. But certainly, it's not deniable that regardless of whether that particular strategy is a deliberate one on the part of the bourgeoisie, that there's always going to be greater strength in unity rather than in division. And the extent to which you can convince working class white people in the Deep South who have never owned slaves, who had never benefited from slavery, that for whatever reason, having free black people live in their communities is bad for them, then that's going to benefit not just them for the reasons that I already pointed out, because they'll be able to artificially keep their wages elevated, but further, it'll benefit all of the power structures, particularly the economic ones, that benefit from that situation in the first place. Because not only will they be able to artificially keep the wages of the white working class elevated, that means that the work that's available to newly freed African Americans is going to be limited as a consequence. Most of the people that are liberated from slavery end up working on the very same plantations that they had been freed from. It's just that now they're getting a wage as opposed to not getting one. And so I add that information just to point out that, like most other issues of power and its abuse, it is not merely, in the case of racism, a matter of ideological power, the belief that your race is better than another race. It has very significant political aspects, as already pointed out, but also very important economic aspects. Questions? So, when we talked about fascism, we talked about Nazi Germany, and I want to return to that because it provides for us the most extreme example of politicized and subsequently militarized racism in history, basically. It provides us with the example of what can actually happen when you give all of the resources of government over to pursuing goals that are specifically racially motivated. So when last we left Nazi Germany, they had seized political control of the country, and they had eliminated the other political parties, and then they had begun to begin passing laws mainly against the Jewish community in terms of restricting their participation in the white-collar labor force. At the same time, they also are beefing up the police state aspect of the country by initiating a secret police force. So one of the things about Nazi Germany, obviously, that most people know about it, even if they know almost nothing else about it, is that it was deeply anti-Semitic and that it persecuted Jewish people to the worst extent that Jewish people have ever suffered persecution, and that's really saying a lot. So the question is, well, why? When we talked about anti-Semitism and we talked about Zionism as that being Herzl's nationalistic solution to the perennial problem of anti-Semitism, which by that point was a 2,000-year-old problem, and his answer to that problem was that Jews clearly had to leave Europe. That the only thing, even when the most advanced in terms of their Enlightenment thinking societies in Western Europe, like France, could still erupt with anti-Semitic slogans and violence, it meant that that problem could happen anywhere, and that given that at the very same time that Herzl was writing The Jewish State, this kind of violence was commonplace in Eastern Europe, meant that his solution was emigration, was nationalism and statehood, but for purposes of what we're talking about here, it was extracting the Jewish population from Europe. Now, it turns out that for most of the time that the Nazis are in power, that's their goal also. Their goal is to extract the Jewish population from Europe. So they're in agreement on that point, which is not a particularly important point so much as just a recognition that the Nazis are coming from this equation from the other end of it. But what they're not doing is coming at it from the traditional aspect of anti-Semitism, which up until the 17th century, after which it begins to wane, is the religious aspect. Nor are they really coming at it from an economic aspect either. Because it's difficult for any person with an unjaundiced eye to look at Jewish contribution to the economy in Germany and think that it's bad. So the question becomes, well, then what is it? If it's not religious dislike, if it's not economic competition, then what is it? And the answer is that it's, and I made reference to this before, it is specifically racial. Going on, and you know, racism is often like this, going on a core truth, which is that Jews have a different geographic origin than most other Europeans do, focus on their quote-unquote alien nature from within your society, and then begin to draw conclusions about that alien nature by pointing to what's wrong with your society and pinning it on them. So, the reading for tonight is from Hitler's writing itself. And this is from Mein Kampf, My Struggle, page 697 in your book. So, lest it be thought that, and I pointed out when we discussed the Nazis before, that the Nazi Party won 3 elections in a row in Germany. It was the largest political party in Germany, and despite the fact that it never won an outright majority, it always had to form coalitions. It's saying a lot that a party that was as explicitly anti-Semitic as Germany was, as the Nazi Party was, won in free and fair elections. So some people are tempted to say, well, they couldn't really have known just how deeply anti-Semitic they were. And there's a little bit of truth to that, as if to say, well, certainly nobody could have imagined, including the Jewish population in Europe itself, that there would be, you know, widespread extermination of the population on a physical level, that people would be murdered, because that just plain hadn't happened before. So that's a fair thing to say, that nobody thought that it would end the way that it did. But in looking at Mein Kampf, it's difficult to think that that nobody knew just how severe the Nazis' position of anti-Semitism was, because he had published it in 1925, and he didn't sugarcoat it. And as I also pointed out the last time we talked about this, the book was a bestseller. He was independently wealthy after publishing it. He never had to work again. So, one final point to make about this. What's really confusing about this is that more than any other country in Europe, the Jewish population in Germany was incredibly well integrated. So the Jewish population in Germany spoke German plainly, and they had been doing so for hundreds of years. Their form of Judaism practiced within Germany, Reform Judaism, was actually devised in Germany to resemble Lutheran Christianity more closely, so that as Jews they would both feel less alien to the culture in which they lived, and that the culture in which they lived would see them as less alien, which meant that they abandoned using Hebrew in their services for German. They abandoned keeping the leader of the service in the center and moved it to the front, like in a Christian church. On top of that, in 1932, the year before the Nazis came to power, more Jews in Germany married non-Jews than married Jews. So you're talking about, first of all, a small minority, less than 1% of the population, but also one that was extremely well integrated. And Germany didn't have a long history of virulent anti-Semitism like other countries in Europe did. It didn't have something like didn't have stuff like happened in Eastern Europe that was largely religiously oriented at first and then was mainly a consequence of Russian anti-Semitism as a particular kind of cultural variant. And it didn't have, so it didn't have that. It didn't have stuff like the Dreyfus affair. So if somebody had come along to you in 1930 and said, well, make it fair and say 1920, because before the Nazis came onto the scene, because then it became clear that if it was going to, something genocidal was going to happen to them, it was going to happen there. But before the Nazis came on the scene, if you had asked somebody where it was most likely that there would be a genocide against the Jewish population, people would have told you Russia. That just would have been their answer, because all of the evidence pointed in that direction. If you told them that it was going to happen, if you said, I come from the future, and actually it's going to happen in Germany, they'd say, you're crazy. In Germany? You're going to have a difficult enough time finding them, because they don't stick out like a sore thumb like they do in Russia, because they're not made to live separately from everybody else like they are in Russia. So, getting back to the question at hand, how is it that this political party with this explicitly expressed anti-Semitism, but that nevertheless has a very well integrated Jewish population that by and large, by most of the population, is considered as German as everybody else, how does it elect a political party like this to lead it? And the answer is because they tried everything else and nothing had worked in terms of the economics of the situation, and so they stumbled upon this, figured they'd give it a shot, and it became a dictatorship before anybody really got control of the situation. But, returning to the text at hand, it cannot really be argued that nobody was clear on where the Nazis stood on this issue. So, the reading begins on page 697. And importantly, on this topic, the primacy of race, Hitler is not talking about Jews. Hitler is talking about non-white races. And he says that anywhere, and this is again very much echoing what Pearson said in the lecture that we looked at in the last class, everywhere that races of people, where the white race in particular mixes with a non-white race, the result is the lowering of the resulting group of people. Such that, he says, over perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, the development of a race to as high a level as that of European society in the 1930s can be destroyed overnight. So this is itself a social Darwinistic point. If you believe that the Europeans are the supreme racial representation of humanity, and you believe very strongly that all of Darwin's principles apply right up to the present moment among human societies, then it can only be that they are the best because they have evolved more, essentially, than anybody else has. Therefore, to pollute this purity with non-white ancestry is to drag it down. And then he offers us his proofs of this. North America, he says, third line of the second paragraph on that page, whose population consists in by far the largest part of Germanic elements who mixed but little with the lower colored peoples, shows a different humanity and culture from Central and South America, where the predominantly Latin immigrants often mixed with the Aborigines on a large scale. By this one example, we can clearly and distinctly recognize the effect of racial mixture. The Germanic inhabitant of the American continent, who has remained racially pure and unmixed, rose to be master of the continent. He will remain the master as long as he does not fall a victim to defilement of the blood. So this is, again, a point made by Pearson in the previous reading. Compare North and South America if you want to see the benefits of racial segregation and racial eradication. There's a lot of research, by the way, coming out now in the last couple of years to suggest that the initial laws that were passed against Jews in Germany were very much inspired by laws that had been passed in the southern United States. He continues, the result of all racial crossing is therefore, in brief, always the following. A, lowering of the level of the higher race. B, physical and intellectual regression, and hence the beginning of a slowly but surely progressing sickness. To bring about such a development is then nothing else but to sin against the will of the eternal Creator. Everything we admire on this earth today, science and art, technology and inventions, is only the creative product of a few peoples and originally perhaps of one race. On them depends the existence of this whole culture. If they perish, the beauty of the earth will sink into the grave with them. So he poses it not just as a principle of racial purity, but as an emergency of racial purity. That this is not only something to be protected because it's valuable, but it needs to be protected because he suggests it's very much at risk. All great cultures of the past perished only because the originally creative race died out from blood poisoning. The ultimate cause of such a decline was their forgetting that all culture depends on men and not conversely, hence that to preserve a certain culture of man who creates it must be preserved. This preservation is bound up with the rigid law of necessity and the right to victory of the best and stronger in the world. That's straight on social Darwinism. And then finally in this section, if we were to divide mankind into three groups, he says we would have the founders of culture, uppermost, and these are the Aryan people, the people of Northern Europe. The bearers of culture, which he says, which he believes, I should say rather, are essentially are other European nations from other parts of Europe, but generally speaking, like not Spain and Portugal, not Rome, not Italy south of Rome, but identifiably white people in Europe who are not of Germanic descent, so the French, mainly the French and the English and the Dutch. And then finally, destroyers of culture. Only the Aryan could be considered as representative of the first group. From him originate the foundation and walls of all human creation. And so if all that is good in culture is created by pure race, then the danger to the continued creation of valuable culture is the pollution of race with the mixing of other races. All who are not of good race in this world are chaff. Chaff is what comes off of wheat when it's threshed, or milled rather, to make flour. A state which in this age of racial poisoning dedicates itself to the care of its best racial elements must someday become lord of the earth. So the last thing that he states in this section on race is that it is the duty of government to protect the purity of race. And that's eugenics. That is government stepping in to assure that the race of the people is not polluted with inferior blood. So again, to make this clear, in that section there is not a discussion of Jews. But it's also true that there is not a problem with African populations in Germany or Asian populations in Germany polluting pure Aryan blood. Really, there are small linguistic communities that are minorities in Germany at this point historically, but the only quote-unquote racial minority that anybody can really identify with any degree of certainty is the Jewish population. And although they're less than 1% of the population for the country as a whole, because they are overwhelmingly urban, in the large cities, they make up more like 5 to 10% of the population. And so they're much more easily identifiable on that basis. So even when he doesn't state it as clearly as he does in the next section, it's clear who he means in referring to this. And then at the bottom of 698, the mightiest counterpart to the Aryan is represented by the Jews. So his the way that he presents the complaint against Jewish people here is that, well, it's multifaceted, but at least to begin with, it is that they fill this role of culture destroyer that he's laid out in the previous section. They're not culture creators, he says, because everything that they create, basically, he says, is filth. And if you want to sort of look at what Jews create, then look at the things that they're involved with, and this is according to him. You know, so they're involved. Well, for one thing, he says, like, look at their involvement in international communism. So that's one big leg of the stool for him is going to be that. And he bases this, to some extent, on observable fact, although by the time he comes to power in Germany, it's no longer actually true. When the Bolsheviks take power in Russia, they have an inordinate, in comparison to the Jewish population at large, an inordinate percentage of Jewish people that are in the leadership. And so, in particular, Trotsky, who's the first minister for war and then the minister for foreign affairs, and he's also mainly the guy they put out on the world stage when they want to have somebody make a good speech, because he's very impressive and highly intellectual. So he becomes a kind of like a boogeyman for not just for communism, but for anti-Semites as well. Now, by the time the Nazis come into power, there's virtually no powerful Jews left in the Soviet Union. They've been purged by Stalin, not because they're Jewish, but because they were around earlier, and so they got pushed out by everybody else. But the initial sort of point of view that he has is to say, is to again seize upon a kernel that is actually true. Yeah, there were a significant number of Jews among the leadership of the Bolsheviks. At least in 1918 there was. So, but then he says, so he says, first of all, Bolshevism is a Jewish creation, and therefore, given the bloodshed and the suffering caused by Bolshevism in Russia since it came into existence there, you can see that it is a negative creation. But he also says this. He says that if you look at banking and international capitalism, particularly that form of capitalism whereby people earn money without actually doing work, but by investing, he says that's Jewish too. So that it's not just that the Jews created Bolshevism and therefore they're bad on that level, but they also created this particularly virulent form of capitalism. So they're responsible for that as well. The art that they create, he says, is decadent art. It's not a good, like sort of like a pure art of good character, but it's art that celebrates the lower pursuits of human beings. And too often, he says, it is connected to pornography. So he says, this is what Jews contribute. They just contribute garbage. And that in and of itself, you would expect of any race of people who was lower than the Aryans, because only the Aryans can create truly great things. The problem is that the Jews, he says, present themselves as whatever group they live among. And so they pollute cultures while acting as if they are members of that culture. The Jewish people, he says, despite all apparent intellectual qualities, is without any true culture, and especially without any culture of its own, for what sham culture the Jew today possesses is the property of the other peoples, and for the most part it is ruined in his hands. Then the third paragraph on that page. Of this first and greatest lie, that the Jews are not a race but a religion, more and more lies are based in necessary consequence. Among them is the lie with regard to the language of the Jew. For him it is not a means for expressing his thoughts, but a means for concealing them. When he speaks French, he thinks Jewish. While he turns out German verses, in his life he only expresses the nature of his nationality. As long as the Jew has not become the master of the other peoples, he must speak their languages whether he likes it or not. But as soon as they become his slaves, they would all have to learn a universal language. So he denies that there's any actual cultural heritage to the Jewish people, and denies that their religion was really anything other than an attempt to insinuate themselves into superior cultures. And this notion about a universal language is the way that he positions, the way that he envisions the Jewish people against his ideal of ultranationalism. Because if nothing demonstrates nationalism more than language, you would be hard-pressed to find it. And so by denying the German people after their destruction through whatever infiltration he believes is taking place is complete, then they would take from the German people even their German language, and in that way destroy them as a nation. And then there's the whole thing about how they defiled the blood of German women. Only an ideology of racial purity can keep the German people on their guard against this. In politics, he begins to replace the idea of democracy by the dictatorship of the proletariat. In the organized mass of Marxism, he has found the weapon with which lets him dispense with democracy, and in its stead allows him to subjugate and govern the peoples with a dictatorial and brutal fist. Hitler is not a fan of democracy by any stretch of the imagination, but he says what makes the Jewish advocacy for democracy particularly insidious is that they do it with the actual intent of instilling Marxist dictatorship as a way of sort of getting the thin edge of the wedge in. Second paragraph on 700. Around peoples who offer too violent a resistance to attack from within, he weaves a net of enemies thanks to his international influence, incites them to war, and finally, if necessary, plants the flag of revolution on the very battlefields. How do Jews infiltrate those societies that resist them? By causing wars between these groups that are too strong and other groups, and destroying the power of both. And then the second to last paragraph on 700 that is italicized. And so the Jew today is the great agitator for the complete destruction of Germany. Wherever in the world we read of attacks against Germany, Jews are their fabricators, just as in peacetime and during the war, and here he speaks of World War I, the press of Jewish stock exchange and Marxists systematically stirred up hatred against Germany until state after state abandoned neutrality and, renouncing the true interests of the peoples, entered the service of the World War coalition. The Jewish thought in all this is clear. The Bolshevization of Germany, that is, to make possible the sweating of the German working class under the yoke of Jewish world finance, which is conceived only as a preliminary to the further extension of this Jewish tendency of world conquest. As often in history, Germany is the great pivot in the mighty struggle. If our people and our state become the victim of these bloodthirsty and avaricious Jewish tyrants of nations, the whole earth will sink into the snares of this octopus. If Germany frees herself from this embrace, this greatest of dangers to nations may be regarded as broken for the whole world. So Germany not only needs to resist Jews, but in doing so, it has to break them so that they provide the way for other nations to defeat them similarly. The way that Hitler and consequently the Nazis conceive of Jewish people, it's even sort of beyond mere racism. There's the word that they use in German to describe the Jews. The word is Gegenrasse, which means, like, it's difficult to translate, but it means like anti-race. But a better translation is like that race which is against everybody else. So if you asked Hitler to rank races in terms of their quality, well, clearly he would put the Aryan race, the Northern Europeans, at the very top, and other Europeans below them. As you move further east in Europe, in particular, you're going to find lower and lower quality of the population as far as he's concerned. Asians are going to fall in under there, with East Asians being better than Southeast Asians and South Asians. And Africans are going to be at the bottom, and Australians are going to be at the bottom. But Jews are going to be outside the whole system. It's not that they're inferior, it's that they're just something entirely different, almost alien. It has an almost kind of cosmic sense about it. And it has that kind of all-encompassing conspiratorial aspect about it, which is to say that every single possible thing that is wrong with your society, you chalk up to them. So that if you were to provide counter-evidence to some issue, it can then be made to seem part of the overall whole rather than as counter-exemplary. So, for example, somebody yells about how they hate Jews because Jews are communists, and you say, but what about all of those people that work at Goldman Sachs, which is named after two Jewish people, and then they say, well, that's all part of the conspiracy. You see, they get you from both sides. So it's not a matter of, you know, being a communist because you believe in the Marxist message and you want to liberate the working classes. It's not a matter of being in capitalism because you want to be rich. It's that you as a Jewish person do either one of those things because you want to subvert other people's cultures and in that way spread your influence and power. So it is a pervasive conspiracy theory, really, when you get right down to it. Now, all that said and done, the solution that he puts forward is not, mass murder. It's, their expulsion to someplace else, not in any kind of nice way, but rather, through any means that are necessary. And that things end up happening in the way that they do, which is to say that, millions of people are murdered, has more to do with the war not going according to the Germans' plans than it does with sort of a pre-devised desire to carry out things in the manner that ultimately they did. So, jump over to page 703. This section is entitled Lebensraum, which means living space. Only an adequately large space on this earth assures a nation of freedom of existence. If the National Socialist movement really wants to be consecrated by history with a great mission for our nation, it must be permeated by knowledge and filled with pain at our true situation in this world. Boldly and conscious of its goal, it must take up the struggle against the aimlessness and incompetence which have hitherto guided our German nation in the line of foreign affairs. Then, without consideration of, quote, traditions and prejudices, it must find the courage to gather our people and their strength to in advance along the road that will lead this people from its present restricted living space to new land and soil, and hence also free it from the danger of vanishing from the earth or of serving others as a slave nation. The National Socialist movement must strive to eliminate the disproportion between our population and our area. So, at the time that he's writing this, you can count 80 million ethnic Germans in Europe, thereby constituting the single largest ethnic population on the continent at that point, other than Russians. But Russians, again, live on two continents, so from the standpoint of a purely European ethnic group, the Germans are the largest. And he says our territory is not commensurate with our size as a people. Viewing this latter as a source of food as well as a basis for power politics between our historical past and the hopelessness of our present impotence, the demand for restoration of the frontiers of 1914 is a political absurdity from such proportions and consequences as to make it seem a crime. So he says, we're not asking for us to get the territory that we lost at the end of World War I, which is territory to France, some territory to Czechoslovakia, and a significant amount of territory to Poland in the east, but rather to go far beyond that. Quite aside from the fact that the Reich's frontiers in 1914 were anything but logical, for in reality they were neither complete in the sense of embracing the people of German nationality nor sensible with regard to geo-military expediency. So not only did the old borders not encompass all German people, but they also didn't provide for the stability economically, militarily, that a country of greatness like Germany requires. The Nazis, he says, must unflinchingly hold in our aim in foreign policy, namely to secure for the German people the land and soil to which they are entitled. And then he says on 704, first full paragraph on that page, much as all of us today recognize the necessity of a reckoning with France, it would remain ineffectual in the long run if it represented the whole of our aim in foreign policy. It can and will achieve meaning only if it offers the rear cover for an enlargement of our people's living space in Europe. If we speak of soil in Europe today, we can primarily have in mind only Russia and her vassal border states. So, I mentioned this in the last class about Germany's desire and the way that Hitler expresses it, their need to expand. Germany's here, and remember, can't go north, there are Germanic people there, and then water. Can't go south, the Alps, and other German people, plus Italy, which is its closest ally. Can't go west, France. He points out that a reckoning with France is necessary, because France has taken German territory at the end of World War I and has reoccupied German territory out of economic necessity at times. But if Germany is truly going to expand, the way that it's going to expand is eastward. So, how does this come to pass? Well, Germany begins to demand territory where German people live from the international community. So it seizes power in Austria in 1938, and then it demands the German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia after that, and the continent almost goes to war over that. But England and France make a deal, basically, and hand over that territory. And then, once that's done, they begin demanding the German-speaking territory in Poland. So, in August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union conduct a secret non-aggression pact. On September 1st, Germany invades Poland. 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union does as well. And they divide Poland between them, erase it from the map. And for the next 2 years, Germany and the Soviet Union are allies. And Germany, as set forth by Hitler in what we just read, settles its accounts with France. So here's another question, similar to the one that I put forward earlier, which is, nobody could deny, given the existence of this book and its circulation broadly in the German population, that Hitler and, by extension, the Nazis were deeply anti-Semitic. It's very difficult to read, if we speak of soil in Europe today, we can primarily have in mind only Russia and her vassal border states, and imagine that that means that, that there will not be a war against the Soviet Union at some point. That people are willing to not take him at his word is essentially what over and over again causes this situation to get worse rather than better. So this is Europe in the summer of 1941. What is gray is what is held by Germany. So basically all of continental Europe, with the exception of Spain and Portugal, Switzerland and Sweden, and the European part of Turkey. What's red is what the Soviets hold. So they manage with essentially just sheer military power to railroad over everybody. They don't have their army everywhere, but where they don't have it, they have countries that are allied with them. So Italy is independent, but it's an ally. So only England, the UK stands against Germany in Europe at this point. Ireland also, I forgot, is independent and neutral. And so just as they say in the book, as he says in the book, having established his, reckoned with France and establishing it as a way to launch a bigger campaign east, it's exactly what he does. And as I mentioned in the last class, that he does so, and does so with the kind of war that is launched there, which is to say one that just completely ignores any of the established laws of war, and just essentially railroads or steamrolls over the entire population without regard for the distinction between civilian and soldier, is racial in its origin. Not only because he sees this as as a power base for international Jewry, but because he sees the Slavic people of Eastern Europe as being inherently inferior and fit only to serve Germans. So it's not a matter of taking Soviet prisoners of war. They'll just shoot them if they need to. If they end up taking them prisoner, they won't feed them. And their overall goal is just to establish what they call a 1,000-year Reich, a 1,000-year rule in Eastern Europe straight out to the Urals. And whatever Slavic people remain, because the Jews will most certainly be expelled, whatever Slavic people remain will be servants. But they envision that half the population will probably die. Half of that half that's left they'll deport over into Asia, and then the rest will be a servant class for them. And they actually begin to implement this process before even the Soviets are completely defeated, because the Soviets are never completely defeated. We enter the war December 8th, 1941. Soviets begin their counteroffensive later that same year. And it's by a process of the war going on for longer than Germany initially intends that ultimately, very slowly but surely, they then decide to take this population of Jews that is under their control and deliberately kill them. So what they have managed to accomplish in the 6 years before the war starts is that they have circumscribed the Jews that are under their control under law, and therefore their freedom is essentially taken away. Their citizenship has been stripped from them, and many have emigrated, so that there's maybe 250,000 left in what Germany controls before the war begins, whereas there had been 3 times that many before the Nazis had come to power. But now in invading Poland, it takes on a population of 3 million more, and invading the Soviet Union, another 5 million. Essentially the whole Jewish population of Eastern Europe. It has no desire to keep them there. It intends to expel them, but it also doesn't have the control of the high seas, and so can't. But also, given the way that they've already begun to treat Soviet prisoners of war, they're not going to give them good rations to eat. They'll shove them in ghettos. They'll allow whatever number to die. And then when they figure out that there's no way that they're ever going to be able to just deport this population, and that the ghetto problem is causing more problems than it had been worth to begin with because it causes disease to spread outside of ghetto walls, they'll just decide to kill them. And again, it is easy to look at the situation from after it having happened and look at Mein Kampf and say, well, of course it ended up this way. Except that it hadn't before. So it was easy for people to get a sense that it might be terrible, but it would be survivable. And further, there had never been, even with colonialism, and this is sort of the key point, there had never been a state ideology of racism that had been empowered to the extent that it was in this case, with a victorious force in the form of the German army, with as large a number of people that it sought to subject or otherwise dominate, that was absolutely helpless. It had happened with colonialism, but remember, particularly in the initial encounters, this had been, the amount of active taking of life had been minimized by the fact that disease was the major factor in subduing the population. Jews have been living in Europe for 2,000 years. They had all of the same immunities that other Europeans did. And so it could not be a problem that was going to be solved as quote-unquote easily as the colonialism problem was solved. Nor, for that matter, was it just simply a matter of being more technologically advanced. So now you have an enemy from the standpoint of Germany, a racial enemy that you now are completely dominant over by virtue of dominating the continent where they by and large live. The only significant population outside of Europe at this point of Jews is in the United States. There's like 5 figures maybe in Palestine at this point, but that's pretty much it. And you can't count on any of the things that colonialism had given you before to not have to undertake this process of actually actively taking life. So this is the sort of the in extremis example of instrumentalized racism. How do you? Because after all, it takes an awful lot of people to kill during a war. By the way, right? I mean, don't forget there's a war going on during all this. To get all of these people to participate in killing millions of people. To say nothing of, just talking about the Jewish population here, this is to say nothing of other groups that were targeted, most of them not on the basis of race, but on their enemy status for some other reason, usually political. So how do you get a state to, how can a state do this, I should say, rather? And again, it has to do with the unrestrained exercise of power toward this goal. So Germany was not a particularly anti-Semitic state in 1933 when the Nazis took power. By the time they rolled their tanks and soldiers into Polish and then subsequently into Soviet territory, they could count on a base level of anti-Semitism among their soldiers, because they had inculcated it in them through propaganda and through, for that matter, through economic recovery that happened at the very same time that the Jews were being extracted from the economic life of the nation. So you just take advantage of that system by which you are able to take that negative aspect that we have biologically for evolutionary reasons and just, put it in good soil and keep it in good sunlight and water it and provide absolutely no positive reinforcement of the idea that your enemy, in this case Jews, are equal to you. And instead just have the process of propaganda go toward reinstilling this belief. So the last part of the reading is propaganda and mass rallies, which on 701, which doesn't, again, have anything to do specifically with anti-Semitism so much as in getting people to believe what you want them to believe. For instance, third paragraph from the bottom of 701, the receptivity of the great masses is very limited. Their intelligence is small, but their power for getting is enormous. In consequence of these facts, all effective propaganda must be limited to a very few points and must harp on these slogans until the last of their public understands what you want him to understand by your slogans. As soon as you sacrifice this slogan and try to be many-sided, the effect will piddle away, for the crowd can neither digest nor retain the material offered. In this way, the result is weakened and in the end entirely canceled out. The way that they're going to accomplish this, to get compliant murderers out of their soldiers and certain proportions of the population, will be to propagandize them with slogans like, "The Jews are our misfortune." And propaganda, remember, just is repetitive and simplistic and pervasive. It uses the mass media. So it's not going to make complicated arguments. Hitler is not going to try, and the Nazis for that matter, are not going to try to tell the people in Germany, well, here's what the problem with the Jews are. They control the international monetary system from both ends, while at the same time really just having the goal of infiltrating your society so they can pollute it with negative culture and take away your nationhood. No, it'll just be the Jews are your misfortune. If you then express a problem that the country is having, then you'll have your ready-made answer. Well, if the economy's bad, it's because the Jews did that. If you feel ashamed as a country for having lost the previous war, the Jews did that too. It becomes your solution to every problem that emerges. And now, given the opportunity to avenge that outrage that has been done to you by these people, because that is what you truly believe, it won't take much for you to participate in that process. One thing that we know for sure is that, particularly in time of war, it's much easier for normal people to do abnormal things. In particular, because there is both the sort of the high adrenaline situation of battle, as well as the diminished responsibility of being in a group rather than having to do terrible things individually. It's not like the Germans were the only people to ever commit war crimes. All armies commit war crimes. It's just a matter of the extent. So, and then to the extent that you can accomplish this through propaganda, the last thing then is to make rootless people feel as if they are part of something. 702. The mass meeting, this is the second to last paragraph from the bottom, necessary for the reason that in it the individual who at first, while becoming a supporter of a young movement, feels lonely and easily succumbs to the fear of being alone, for the first time gets the picture of a larger community, which in most people has a strengthening, encouraging effect. The same man without company or battalion, surrounded by all his comrades, would set out on an attack with a lighter heart than if left entirely on his own. In the crowd, he always feels somewhat sheltered, even if 1,000 reasons actually argue against it. So make him feel part of something. And then on top of it, the Nazis were really good at putting a show on. So have your party rallies with torchlight brigades, and Hitler was a particularly talented public speaker, so have him speak to them and get them whipped up. Have your paramilitary be dressed in uniforms that are literally designed by Hugo Boss. And that's going to go a long way toward getting people on board. And then you'll have them on board before you need them to pull triggers. The one thing that we know by virtue of other situations like this having occurred